So I think these last 22, 23, and 24 are all three chapters of sort of saying farewell and commissioning the children of Israel to live in the land. The section is called Living in the Promises. But it's also living out the promises as well. You know, they're living in the land. They've gotten, you know, their territory, and then they have to live in it. But it's sort of living it out, isn't it? Working out, you know, all of this faithfulness that we have to do, working out those promises now as they've been given the land. So here we come up to the last section of everything's been divided. Everybody's got their home, they've got their territory. So now here is Joshua sending 2.5 tribes back to their inheritance and then saying farewell, giving them a benediction, giving them an encouragement and saying, now you get to live in the promises. So altars of assumption, chapter 22. And after 7 years of those 2.5 tribes helping Israel, and if you remember from chapter 1, when Joshua said to them, you know, are you willing to help them and be faithful to the children of Israel, even though you have your inheritance? Are you willing to come over? And they said, yes, we will support, we will fight every day that you need us. And you know what? That's exactly what they did. They kept their word. They fought every day. They were faithful to their promise. So last time, we saw that the Levites got their property and they had these cities of refuge. So now in verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, at that time Joshua summoned the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, you have kept all that Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, and you have obeyed my voice in all that I have commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days down to this day, but you have been careful to keep the charge of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given you rest, has given rest to your brothers, as he promised them. Therefore turn and go to your tents in the land where your possession lies, which Moses the servant of the Lord gave you on the other side of the Jordan. Only be very careful to observe the commandment of the Lord that Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cling to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. And so here's this lovely picture of Joshua just saying thank you and saying they have been faithful. And just what a refreshing thing to have faithfulness. And to have the faithfulness of these 2.5 tribes, and for Joshua to go, you did it. You were faithful every day. You did what you said that you were going to do. And he commends them. And I love that portion of it, because it's like, yeah, somebody was faithful. They did it, you know, and you read it. And it's always so much better, isn't it, when they serve the Lord all the days of their life. Don't you just love those kings that said that? There's not many of them. But when it says, and they were faithful, like, yeah, it's a blessing. And you know, Joshua commends them for it as well. He recognizes it and he says to them, thank you. You were faithful. You did it, you know, and he was careful to do that. And that's great that faithfulness can be praised and can be thanked. But then he goes on and he says, I'm going to send you back. You can go back to your possession, but you need to walk in the ways of the Lord, because now he's going to release them. So he doesn't say, off you go. He's going to give them an encouragement. And he says they need to walk in the ways. He calls them to hear the word of the Lord, to love the Lord, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, to hold fast. My version says to cling as well. Cling to the Lord and to serve. All of those things. And I love that. I love that you need to love the Lord. You need to hear from him. Love him so that you can walk out faithfully. If we don't walk out in love, it's just legalism, isn't it? So the Lord calls us to love and then to walk that out and to keep his word, but to cling. Cling to the Lord. And I love that expression, that just cling to the Lord. And as he releases them, he's like, he can't be there. He's not going to see them, but he wants them to cling to the Lord. It's like, I can't be with you every day, but you've got the Lord. You've got him. Cling to him. And I love that. I love that expression. It also says in verse 8, it goes down and he says to them, he says to go back to their tents with much wealth and with very much livestock, with silver, gold, bronze, and iron, and with much clothing. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brothers. And so they got spoil, which is their reward, isn't it? Spoils is always a reward for battle. And so for their faithfulness, for their service, they got a reward. They were given wealth, they were given livestock, and they were given possessions, gold, and all of this. And so Joshua was faithful back to them. He didn't forget them. He remembered them and gave them their due reward as well. And so this first half is just a wonderful picture of faithfulness, of encouragement, and commending. And then we get into the next part. Now, I have a slide of the territories of Israel, just so that you have a little picture in your head as to where everybody is. And I always love maps. And so you have these 2.5 tribes, because you've got Reuben, Gad, and then you've got East Manasseh, and then you have Manasseh. And so that is one big tribe, but half of them was over the eastern side of the River Jordan, and the other half was over on the western side. And so you have the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee up at the top, and then the River Jordan that splits them down the middle. So these tribes, if you've read in Numbers, they asked for that land on that side of the Jordan. And Moses said, okay, you can have it. It wasn't God's first idea, but they asked for it. And so Moses consulted God, and God said, yep, you can have that territory. So that's where they landed, and that's where they said, but their condition for having that land is that you go over and you help your brothers. That was their condition. And so that's why Joshua was commending and saying, yeah, you did it. You did what you said you would do, so you can go back to your land. So that's where they're going. So they're going back, they're crossing over to the River Jordan. And it took about 7 years for this whole process, from chapter 1 to chapter 22. The commentaries say that it's about 7 years. So they served faithfully for 7 years without their children and their wives. And, I don't know whether they got to go back and see them. I'm not quite sure how that all panned out. But it was 7 years of faithful service that they did. And so here they go, commended to be faithful after leaving the battle. Now, it's a different kind of faithfulness, isn't it? There's faithfulness in the battle when it's weary, when you've got a lot of trials against you. We hold on and we have to be faithful. But here Joshua is saying, now you have to go home and settle and live and just do the duties of the day. Live and, dig a hole, put up a wall, wash some dishes, just all of these mundane. It's a different kind of faithfulness that now we have to have. And I think Joshua saw that, and they've been faithful in the fight. But now they're going to be called to be faithful in the day-to-day, when it gets a little bit boring, when things aren't as exciting as, fighting battles and wearing armor. And now you just, digging for your food and things like that. So here's a different kind of faithfulness. And this is where Joshua is saying, when all the exciting things have ended, we still need to cling to the Lord in the same way as when there was the trials and the hardships. Even in the mundane and the everyday, we still need to cling to the Lord. Now, it's interesting in this section because it does name the tribes. It says there the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh. Now, one of the themes is all Israel that, goes throughout Joshua. But here we've got a bit of a naming, and we've got the eastern tribes and we've got the western tribes. So this whole theme of all is now beginning to see a few little cracks. And it's got the River Jordan running right down in the middle of it. And so we start to see some of the trials and the issues that are going to arise later on and later in this chapter as well. And this whole idea of all is now identifying these tribes and a few little cracks in the all. It's not quite all. So in verse 10, they go home, or they go towards the home, and it says, and when they came to the region of the Jordan, that is in the land of Canaan, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by the Jordan, an altar of imposing size. And the people of Israel heard it said, Behold, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh have built the altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan, in the region about the Jordan, on the side that belongs to the people of Israel. And when the people of Israel heard it, the whole assembly of the people of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. So as they're going home, they make an altar. But what they do is they actually make it on Israel's side. So it's not on their side, it's on the western side, which sometimes you can miss. So they make it on their side and then they go over. Now, they hear about it and it's imposing, which means it's really big. And so they can see it from both sides of the Jordan. They can see this big old altar. Now, the problem with this altar is in Leviticus 18, verse 8 and 9, it says, And you shall say to them, any one of the house of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn among them, who offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of the meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from his people. And also in Deuteronomy chapter 12, it's a little bit more of a detailed, and this is why it's an issue here, why the people gathered together, because they might just like, oh, you built an altar. What is the big deal? Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 12, there is an importance of making sacrifices on the chosen place, on the place that the Lord has chosen. And Moses tells them that the statutes and the rules that you shall carry out to do in the land of the Lord your God, the Lord of your God of the fathers, has given you to possess all the days that you live on the earth. You shall surely destroy all the places that the nations whom you dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash them in pieces, their pillars, and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images, their gods, and destroy their name. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all the tribes to put his name and to make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and all your sacrifices, your tithes and the contributions that you present, your vow, your offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and your flock. There you shall eat before the Lord your God. So there's this one place. And God did not want them to be like the Canaanites, who worshipped just everywhere, had altars everywhere and worshipped everywhere as just their free will decided. God wanted them to do one worship in one place, in that unity together, just the one. And that was all that was allowed. There were to be no other altars and no other sacrifices except that one place that God appointed. And it represents this unity, the unity of one God. And that worship isn't for us just to decide how we do it willy-nilly. You know, it's not like the Canaanites and, oh, let's just do this for worship, let's just do that. God's like, no, you're going to do it the way I say it. Worship has to be in spirit and in truth. And in truth, it's got to be the way God orchestrates on that altar. That's what we're going to do. So obviously, when they hear about this altar, they get a little bit annoyed. And what they do is they gather the people together. They gather up in arms. And it says, in verse 13, and the people of Israel sent to the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh in the land of Gilead, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, and with him 10 chiefs, one from each of the tribal families of Israel, every one of them the head of the families among the clans of Israel. And they came to the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh in the land of Gilead. So here we've got a division. We've got 2.5 tribes against all the other tribes. And so we've got this division where they come. And so they confront them. And it is interesting, actually, what Phinehas confronts them with, because I just read to you the law of what God has said and why they're up in arms. But Phinehas actually doesn't approach them this way. What Phinehas says, he says, thus says the whole congregation of the Lord, what is this breach of faith that you have committed against the Lord God of Israel in turning away this day from following the Lord by building yourselves an altar this day in rebellion against the Lord? Have we not had enough of the sin at Peor, from which even yet we have not cleansed ourselves, and for which came a plague upon the congregation of the Lord, that you too must turn away from this day from following the Lord? And if you rebel against the Lord today, then tomorrow he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel. But now, if the land of your possession is unclean, pass over into the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take for yourselves a possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord or make us as rebels by building for yourselves an altar other than the altar of the Lord. Did not Achan, the son of Zerah, break faith in the matter of the devoted things, and wrath fell upon all the congregation of Israel? And did he not perish alone? And he did not perish alone for his iniquity. So Phinehas actually reminds them of past sins. He brings up Peor, which I'm not going to read, I'm not going to explain, but if you have a workbook, it's part of the digging deeper, for you to dig deeper and find out exactly what happened at Peor. But there was sin there that needed to be cleansed, and Phinehas was there cleansing it. He was involved in it, which is interesting because here he's now taken arms and he's saying, remember what happened back then. And what they're doing is they see this altar, and although they're not giving them the law, they're saying, you know what? You are going to bring judgment on us. They recognize that other people's sins actually affected them. And Achan, remember Achan? You know, we don't have to go too far back to remember him, that he got burnt and possibly the rest of his family. But because they went to war when they shouldn't have, there were men that died needlessly because of him. And so here Phinehas is saying, we don't want your sin to affect us. So he's coming against them in a way of sort of cleansing the land. You know, he doesn't necessarily want to just kill people necessarily, but he doesn't want their sin to cause them death and cause them hurt. And so this is why he's coming up against them, which is interesting. He also offers a solution as well in verse 19. You know, so he's not, they've come to make war. As it says that they did come to make war and were willing to, but he did offer them a solution and saying, look, if your land's not good enough, then come over to our land. And he was willing to sacrifice some of their land so he didn't have to kill them. So he didn't necessarily want to kill them, but he wanted the sin to be gone. And if that meant killing them, then he would, but he gives them an option. Look, if your land's not good enough, then come over. We'll make room for you. You know, they would have to sacrifice some of the land, but he's willing to do that because he doesn't want sin there. And that's something that's admirable in Phinehas here. It looks a bit drastic, and we will cover that, but you know, you do see he's zealous for the Lord. He wants there to be no sin in Israel. And it's interesting, the structure of the text as we walk through it. Because if you remember Achan, the narrator gave you a bit of a giveaway, didn't it? It began the chapter by saying, and Achan stole the devoted things. And so you already knew that there was sin even before it all happened and before he was judged. And we knew it was Achan as well, even though the people didn't. So it was an interesting way the writer portrays the whole thing. Well, this is a little bit different. We don't actually know the motives of the 2.5 tribes until we go through it with them. So it's a little bit a different piece of writing. We're sort of walking through this with Phinehas and the rest of them as well. Because if we go on, they obviously, you know, they tell them and they say, look, if your land's unclean, come over. And then in 21 it says, then the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh said in answer to the heads of the families of Israel, the mighty one, God the Lord, the mighty one, God the Lord, he knows, and let Israel itself know, if it was in rebellion or in breach of faith against the Lord, do not spare us today for building an altar to turn away from following the Lord. Or if we did so, to offer burnt offerings or grain offerings or peace offerings on it, may the Lord himself take vengeance. No, but we did it from fear that in time to come your children might say to our children, what have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? For the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you. You people of Reuben and people of Gad, you have no portion in the Lord. So your children might make our children cease to worship the Lord. Therefore we said, let us now build an altar, not for burnt offering, not for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you, and between our generations after us, that we do perform the service of the Lord in his presence with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings. So your children will not say to our children in time to come, you have no portion in the Lord. And we thought, if this should be said to us or to our descendants in time to come, we should say, behold, the copy of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings, nor for sacrifice, but to be as a witness between us and you. Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away this day from following the Lord by building an altar for burnt offering, grain offering, and sacrifice other than the altar, the Lord God that stands before the tabernacle. So here we have their response. And, you know, if it's the first time reading, at first you're like, they're building an altar. They need to be judged, you know. And then you hear their side and it's like, oh, okay. So their motive wasn't idolatry. It wasn't to sacrifice. That wasn't what they were going to do. In fact, it was out of fear for their children in time to come, because they were afraid that the rest of Israel are going to say, hey, what have you got to do with us? And they could say, well, the altar, that's the witness. So that was the reason why they built their altar. And it's interesting as we read it, because we actually learn their reasoning as soon as Phineas does. And we're like, oh, okay. And the answer's satisfactory. And, you know, Phineas says, okay, that's great. And he says, today, later on in verse 31, it says, today we know that the Lord is in our midst, because you have not committed this breach of faith against the Lord. So Phineas is satisfied with that answer. Now, it's an interesting chapter to look at, and that there are, you know, some interesting things about it. And there are some people agree and disagree on certain things. Some people commend the tribes of Israel, and some people will say, well, they just jumped to conclusions and, you know, went in there guns blazing, and you know, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions. But you know, there's points to both sides of that, because, you know, obviously I entitled it Altars of Assumption, and it was an altar of assumption. But both sides are assuming, you know, you have the Israel were assuming that they were going to sacrifice and they were going into idolatry. But also, the 2.5 tribes were also assuming that in time to come, Israel's going to forget them. So they themselves were making an assumption as well. It was an assumption that came out of fear, though. And it was fear that they were going to be forgotten by the rest of Israel, that this divider of the River Jordan was going to cut them off. And so that was their assumption. But overall, I think the whole interaction is a good one. And I think we can learn a lot from it. There might be mistakes. There might be some things we can say, oh, they could have done that better. But you know what? We can always do things better. You know, I love the fact that they dealt with the situation. And they did deal with it. Maybe we can pick it apart and say, well, they could have done this, that, and the other, and we can do. And we can learn from that. But we can also go, you know what? They dealt with it. They actually stood up and they dealt with it. And they listened to one another. So one of the lessons, interesting points that we have, in verse 11 and both verse 12, it says, the people of Israel heard, it said, the people of Reuben have built this altar. And it says again in verse 12 as well, that they heard this thing. Now, this is all on hearsay. They heard. Now, it did actually happen, and they did build an altar, so there wasn't any lies going about, but obviously somebody heard it and didn't go to talk to them and find out why. They decided instead to tattle on Phineas and the rest of them, and they went tale-bearing. Now, maybe that was actually a good thing. Maybe they thought, who am I to go and confront these people anyway? And I think it might be better for Phineas to deal with it. You know, he's in authority. So it could be a good thing to go straight to authority. Could be. Might also not be. Maybe they could have averted a few things, you know, by approaching them themselves and going straight to them. Hey, what you doing? You know, and getting a few answers. Oh, and they could have told them. Could have averted a whole huge situation. It could have, but Again, we're all just speculating. Who knows what could have, should have happened? We don't, do we? This is the way it panned out. But we do have to think about hearsay. What is hearsay? And there's a lot of it that goes around. Hearsay doesn't hold up in a court of law. You can't say, well, such and such told me. That doesn't hold up. That is not evidence. And that's not proof. So we have to be very careful with hearsay. We have to be careful with what we hear. Because by the time this got back to all of Israel decided to gather. I mean, you've got the whole people, they're all into it now, aren't they? Because of this hearsay. I mean, they've gotten everybody involved. And that's what hearsay does, isn't it? We hear something and we want to get everybody involved. Everybody's got to know about this. And the more people that know, then the more we can conquer it. And, well, maybe, but thankfully, war was averted. But thankfully, that could have had a real issue, and that's what we commend at the end. Actually, the war was averted, and they did do the just thing at the end, but they did come with their guns blazing, ready to make war just because of hearsay. And when we assume things, which is what they did, looking at the altar going, oh, we're just assuming that they're going to sacrifice. Now, it is a good assumption. Why else would you make an altar? I mean, you can't blame them for coming to that conclusion. You make a car and, oh, actually, I'm not going to drive it. You can't blame them for jumping to that conclusion. However, it was an assumption, and that wasn't, that wasn't actually the motive. But assumptions can lead to accusations, because they did accuse them, didn't they, of idol worship, which actually wasn't what they were doing. They did build an altar, yeah, they were guilty of that, but they weren't guilty of idol worship. That was not the motive. So with our assumptions can lead to accusations. However, we need to learn that communication can bring clarity, which is what happens in this chapter, isn't it? When they communicate, they then begin to understand, and they understand the situation, and then it all becomes a little bit more clear, which I think is why this chapter is written the way it is. The narrator could have said in the very beginning, but their intention wasn't to worship. But he didn't. He left it until for us to find out too, because we're riding along with the assumptions as well, aren't we? And it's like, oh, oops. Oh, I was judging them in my heart too as I was reading it, but no, that actually wasn't their motive. So maybe that's why, the narrator does that for us to see. Can't always make accusations based on our assumptions as to what we see. Their motivation might be different. Proverbs 18:17. It's a great one. If you make notes, write that one down, because this is one that's should help you through life. And it says, the one who states his case first seems right until another comes to examine him. How true is that? The first one to state their case. It's like, ooh, wow, that's terrible. And then I think the CSB says, and then the cross-examination begins. And I like that. It's like, yeah, because then all of a sudden, once you start examining the case and going, okay, well, what did you do? A lot of us have children, and when they get in a fight, she hit me. Oh, and you want to tell the child off, but a wise mother would go, okay, and what did you do? I called her ugly. Okay. Well, and it's like, oh, okay, well, now it all becomes a little bit more clear, Once you start finding out a little bit more information, once you start hearing the other side of things, it's like, it brings a little bit of a different picture. In this chapter right here, the first person to state their case seems right, and then there's a cross-examination, then we're like, oh, okay, that wasn't quite right. So that's a brilliant proverb that can take us through all of life. Sometimes the one who gives their case first is right. I mean, it's not all the time. Sometimes they are right, but it shows us we need to communicate, ask questions, find out the heart, find out what is going on. So that cross-examination. But if you act on hearsay, then we can make those accusations, and if we're not willing to listen, it could lead to disaster. In Proverbs 11:9, it says, with his mouth, the godless, or some versions will say hypocrite, would destroy his neighbor, but by knowledge the righteous are delivered. And what a perfect proverb for this story. Because here by their mouths, by accusing them, they could have destroyed their neighbors. They got weapons in hand and they were accusing them. But by knowledge, the righteous are delivered. When they stopped to hear and gain knowledge of what actually was happening, the righteous were delivered. And so we have to be careful with our mouths, with what we're saying, with what we're hearing, and repeating what we're hearing. When we repeat things as to what we've heard, we could be destroying other people without knowledge. Only with a limited amount of knowledge we can destroy our neighbors. But it's with understanding and knowledge that the righteous are delivered. So gossip, hearsay, it's all things that can be very dangerous and can, as we know, Proverbs says, divides friends. And it does. And we've probably all experienced it, or seen it. We see it in the news, don't we? You see it with celebrities. We see it, all over the place, that gossip destroys people's reputations and it divides people. It's very dangerous. Leviticus 19:16 says, do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not jeopardize your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Now that's interesting. And I think this is the NIV version, or it might be the New Living. But I like that translation of it because it kind of links the two. Don't go about spreading slander among your people. Don't just walk around telling information about people that you might not know is true. Don't just go, oh, I heard this, and let me just spread that, and let me just tell you about this and tell you about that. And then it says, do not jeopardize your neighbor's life. It can be so destructive. It can, like I said, destroy reputations, but also right here, destroy lives. Gossip and slander destroys lives. We need to be careful with what we're hearing and what we're passing on as well, not just, listening to things all the time, particularly if it's slander. And how do we know if it's true or not? Well, you know what? We can find out, can't we? If we hear something, we can find out. And I would bet gossipers would stop very quickly if we actually did get to the source, or even if we said to people, oh, shall I go talk to that person then? Shall I go talk to them and say that I found out that information from you? I would imagine that would stop a lot of gossipers from spreading things if we could say to them, well, can I go check that out? Or have you checked that out? Have you spoken to that person yourself? Do you know? In fact, I was in a conversation, and because I've been studying for this, I was sat with one of our really good friends, and he told me some information about somebody. And so, because I've been listening, I'm like, oh, I just listened to gossip. And so I looked at him, I said, well, did she tell you that? And he went, I saw it. So I'm like, and it wasn't like sin or anything like that. It was just something a bit weird. So I'm like, oh, okay. Fair enough. But I don't want to be a part of somebody just say, and then I'm going to repeat it, or I'm going to say, oh, and I've now got this image in my mind of somebody. And what if he just heard it from somebody else who heard it from somebody else who, that happens. So, there's nothing wrong with saying, oh, did they tell you that? How do you know that? And, did you find that? How did you find that out? And obviously he saw it. It's like, no, I saw it. That's why I'm concerned, because I saw it. Okay, fair enough. So Proverbs 11:13, a gossip betrays a confidence, but a trustworthy person keeps a secret. And so you can always be sure that gossipers are going to betray confidence, but the trustworthy person not keeps a secret as in sinister secrets, but keeps confidence. There are confidential things that we need to keep. And there are times when somebody might need to talk in confidence. And that's not the same as gossip. And we have to understand the difference. And generally the difference is if that person has a personal wound that they need to talk about in confidence, then we can let them talk about it. But if it's purely, oh, such and such, if it's got nothing to do with them, then that's just gossip. That's what that is. So it's having that wisdom and knowing when somebody needs to confide in us, and then we need to keep that to ourselves and allow the healing to happen to that person with the other person. That's keeping confidence. And that's different to the gossip. But we want to be that trustworthy person, not the person that goes around saying, well, I heard this. Because you can guarantee that when somebody does that, your reaction, is usually, especially if somebody betrays your trust, well, what are you going to do? You're going to think, I'm not going to tell them anything. I'm sure we've probably all experienced telling someone something, and then they went and told such and such and such and such, and you're like, not telling that person anything again. We've all been there. And that's what this proverb is saying. Don't be that person. You want to be somebody that can keep things to yourself. Don't. Plus, who knows what they're saying about you as well? The gossiper. If they're saying stuff about somebody else, who knows what they're saying about me? Like, oh, okay. We want to give a gossiper a wide berth. And the Proverbs say, don't hang around with gossipers either, because they'll be gossiping about you, sure enough. So be a person that can keep confidentiality. So that's one point. And like I said, maybe it was wise of those people to go to Phinehas. Maybe it was. Maybe not. I don't know. But there's some other points as well that we can quickly consider about this story. They build the altar right after Joshua says, walk faithfully, cling to the Lord. And so this is their interpretation of clinging to the Lord. And it was also the other tribe's interpretation of clinging to the Lord too, by confronting them. So each side did their interpretation of clinging to the Lord, and yet misunderstanding still arose. And that often happens. We're each just trying to walk out our faith, but we can create a misunderstanding, just ignorantly create it. It also shows that each side had their own fears as well, which is also interesting. One side was fearing idolatry and wanted to eradicate sin. And the other side was fearing that their generations will be eradicated from the other people as well. I'm going to silence my phone. It's me, not you. That's dinging. It's me. But it's also interesting that they built this altar, a huge altar. That's a pretty drastic action. So if you perform a pretty drastic action, then don't be surprised if you get a drastic reaction as well. That's going to happen, isn't it? It's an unusual thing to do, and it's not really what you're supposed to do either. And again, the heart of building the altar was so that their future generations would not be cut off. And yet, ironically, in building the altar, it almost resulted in their immediate cutting off, didn't it? And that's the irony of what they did. It's quite funny, really, how ironic it is that they build this altar to stop division, and yet they almost caused a huge war by doing it. And sometimes we can be the agents of bringing about the reality of our fears as well, because they almost did, didn't they? They themselves, by being so afraid and wanting to stop this fear of their future generations, well, there almost wasn't any future generations for them because they almost got killed. So the other one is that hindsight is an amazing thing, and it really is. Now, it is a shame that these eastern tribes did not think of the problem in Numbers 32 when they asked for the land instead of in Joshua 22. Now, when they asked for that land at the other side, they weren't thinking about their future generations. They just thought, oh, that looks great. Well, now they're settling in it. All of a sudden, they're like, oh, wait. Like, we should have thought of that before. But we don't, though, do we? We just see things and go, oh, this looks good. Let's have it here. And we don't always think. We don't have that hindsight. And neither did they. And the other irony was that Israel saw the altar as an expression of infidelity, and the eastern tribes saw it as a prevention of infidelity as well. So just two different sides, one altar, and literally two sides, two viewpoints at this one altar. One of them seen it as idolatry, and the other one wanting to prevent the idolatry, motivations of their heart. And this is what we can commend both tribes, actually, of that communication. Now, although these tribes, they came, didn't they, bearing arms and accusing, which is what a lot of the commentaries say, oh, they shouldn't have been accusing, and they probably shouldn't. They should have asked questions a little bit more. That's always helpful. Ask questions. Don't go in guns blazing and accuse. Ask the questions and find out. But they didn't. They accused. But thankfully, the 2.5 tribes, well, they answered with a gentle answer, didn't they? They actually were very honest and said, you know what? If we've done anything wrong, the Lord can kill us, or you can kill us. Their conscience were clean. And so that gentle answer turned away the wrath, which I love. And I love the fact that those 2.5 tribes did that, because they could have gone, you're accusing us. How dare you? What do you think of us? You think we're that bad? And, that's what happens when you accuse somebody. They take offense. But actually, I would imagine those 2.5 tribes heard their accusations, heard their fears, of this is what happened. God, he cursed us, and look at Achan, and look what happened. So these 2.5 tribes probably thought, yeah, I see how that looks. And so they answered with a very soft answer, going, you know what, that was not what we thought. And I love that they answered that. They didn't take offense, but they listened and understood where they were coming from. And it's that listening and having a heart to listen and learn what the motivation of the other person was. And when Israel slowed down and listened to them, it was satisfactory, wasn't it? Like, oh, okay. I understand your side of it now. It's a beautiful picture of two parties listening to one another and reconciling and having that peace. And it's listening and it's understanding. That's the other part. We can sit and listen, but sometimes we're listening to, diffuse their accusations or blame them or turn it, or, sometimes that's how we listen, to defend ourselves. I'm going to defend myself and I'm going to accuse them back. But do we listen with a heart to understand? And that's what both sides did. And so with all the faults, the hearsay, or maybe they came with accusations, the assumptions, the main thing was they had the heart to listen to another person's heart. That's what they did. And that's what averted the war. It was that right there, that listening to each other and going, oh, okay, see how that looks. I get it now. Now I understand from your point of view. And it's these two different sides trying to live out what Joshua commanded. Two different expressions as well. So it's only when these expressions are understood and motives are honorable to the Lord that there's that unity. And I do find it interesting, that Joshua commanded them to walk faithfully before their God. But even before they got home, they were concerned about what other people were going to do in future generations. Kind of reminds me of Peter, when the Lord commissions him and he goes, hey, but what about him? And God literally says, that's none of your concern. I'm talking to you. And it's almost as though these tribes, they're walking home and they're told to cling to the Lord. And what do? But what if they don't cling to the Lord? What if they do? No, Joshua said, you cling to the Lord. You do it. If they were concerned about their own walk, they wouldn't have to be concerned about other people or future generations. See, I actually don't think that altar was needed. I don't think they needed to build an altar. That's my personal opinion, anyways, on the whole situation. I don't think they needed an altar. I think they just needed to go home and do what Joshua said, cling to the Lord, walk faithfully. Because if they're clinging to the Lord and they're going over to sacrifice and they're keeping their fellowship, well, Israel won't cut them off because they're still in fellowship. And if Israel does cut them off, well, the Lord will defend them because the Lord is on their side, because they're clinging to the Lord. So I don't really think they needed an altar. However, they thought that they did, and it turned out all right in the end, and maybe served as a warning to the other side not to cut them off. But I think we need to be concerned about ourselves and not concerned about other people, because that's where everything then started spiraling out of control, when they weren't just focusing on their own walks with the Lord. But I do like this chapter. I do think it's a really wonderful and encouraging example of people that are faithful, that walked 7 years faithfully, but also two sides that are willing to listen, that were willing to look at their motives and not just their actions. And there was peace between them, and it was satisfactory. And that Phinehas said, the Lord is in our midst. And God was still faithful, even though maybe the altar shouldn't have been there, maybe it was fine that they did, I don't know. But God's like, you know what, I'm still here. Altar or no altar, I'm still here. And you still cling to me. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for this chapter. Lord, that you put just these interesting stories in that sometimes we can just read right past them. But Lord, when we look at them, we just see wonderful examples of the faithfulness of you, but also the faithfulness of people. And how encouraging it is when people are faithful. It's so refreshing. Lord, may we be those faithful people. Lord, may you say, well done, good and faithful servant. May those be words that you can say to us. May they be words that other people can say to us. And Lord, may they be words that we can say to other people as well. Lord, may we encourage other people when we see faithfulness. May we say thank you and acknowledge their faithfulness. And Lord, may we have ears to hear and hearts to learn about the motives of other people. May we listen to other people's hearts, not just their actions, but hear their hearts, Lord. Give us those ears. Let us lay down our weapons and not assume, but ask questions and walk in love. In your name, amen.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness